Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another live session at the Reactor. My name is Rav, and I'm the Program Manager at Reactor London. Before we begin, please take a moment to read our Code of Conduct. We are all here to learn, so please be respectful and mindful and be considerate in the way you engage. The chat will be open throughout, and we do encourage you all to participate. Today is the third and final episode of Open Source on Azure series, and we will be learning all about open source from a maintainer's perspective. The session will be led by Kevin and Paul, who are both Microsoft MVPs, and I will now hand over to them. Hi, Kevin. Hello,
Hi,
Paul.
thanks very much, Rav.
Hello.
So hopefully Paul's going to get the slides up and we'll get started. Brilliant. So thank you for all those who've joined us for their previous two sessions. You may notice that my co-host this time is slightly less beardy than usual. So unfortunately, Gary wasn't available and Paul has very kindly stepped in. What you'll also be glad to know is he is also an open source maintainer. So we'll introduce ourselves on the next slide. But what we're going to do is talk about things from a maintainer's perspective. So it's things that maintainers have to do and what you as a contributor or even a user of open source software should think about within that. So Paul, if you want to jump up and we can introduce ourselves. If you haven't listened to previous sessions, my name is Kevin McDonald. I'm the practice lead for Modern Workplace at CPS. We're a Microsoft Gold partner. We do all things Microsoft across the board with Microsoft, not just Microsoft 365. I've been working with SharePoint for about 17 years, which is slightly depressing thought on there, and started off initially in financial services and jumped over the fence to a bit of consultancy. As Rav mentioned, an MVP focused on the Office apps and services side, and also the co-host of the Grey Hat Beard podcast, where every week we talk about all things Microsoft 365 in the world of modern workplace. Paul, do you want to say hello?
Hello, everybody. So my name is Paul Bullock. I'm a solutions architect at CPS. So I've been in a similar level of experience as Kevin. So about 16 years with SharePoint, about 8 years with Office 365. So it's most of the lifetime of the products. I'm also an Office development MVP as well. So I've done a lot of contributions in the community. I'm a member of the Microsoft 365 patterns and practice team. Also a open source maintainer of an initiative called the PnP Script Samples repository that's been running since mid-year last year. I've got a few contact points, so if you want to reach me on Twitter or LinkedIn or GitHub, I'm more contactable on Twitter if you have any questions or want to engage with those initiatives.
Lovely. Thanks, Paul. So let's get over to the agenda and what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to start off with what is an open source maintainer. If you saw the first show in the series, we talked about what is open source and that kind of idea of the book library. So we'll talk a little bit about that and what they do. More specifically, talking about how they manage pull requests, managing issues, setting the strategy, and then how they handle disputes on there. Because everyone likes a good argument when it comes to being on the internet. So they are the arbiters there to talk about that. And then in the kind of second part of this, we'll talk a bit more about how you as a contributor and a user can work with the maintainers, and then maybe thinking about that journey to becoming maintainer on an existing project, or instead going it alone and setting up your own repository. We'll do a bit of a wrap up and hopefully leave some good time for questions at the end. If you do have questions, do throw them in the comments, however you're consuming it, and we should see those and answer them as we go along. But let's kick off, I think, with what is an open source maintainer. So I think generally, as a simple answer, a maintainer is the person who maintains an open source repository. For those who are joining from the UK, yes, it does exactly what it says on the tin, almost. It's how you maintain that repository on there. And you might have more than one. It's not necessarily that single person that comes through there. There can be more than one, that committee, and it may be you have organized different roles. So some people will be focused on pull requests, others on issues, or you might just be all happily skipping, holding hands together and picking up whatever needs to be done at the right time. It really can change depending on the repository and the involvement of that actual project on there. But it seems a bit silly me talking about this when we have Paul, an actual maintainer here. What do you do?
So because I mentioned earlier that I was a member of the patterns and practice team, so just to expand on that slightly, so Microsoft 365 patterns and practice team is a community outside of Microsoft that shares resources with each other for the technology or any sort of customization, scripts, samples, all of those kind of things that people build in industry. But you might find that instead of reinventing the wheel, you want to put it in a central location where you can then use that resource yourself within any new projects and then share back any sort of learnings with each other. So over the years, this repository has grown and grown. It's become quite large. I think there's some 1,500 contributors across the board, possibly a bit higher. And so my role within that is I own a repository called PnP Script Samples. And what that means is it's a location within the community that allows me to share, or allows people to share, scripts. So this will be PowerShell scripts or Bash scripts with each other that interact with the 365 service. So Microsoft 365 comes with a set number of APIs. So and what someone has done years ago is created a set of repositories for, a set of tools for interacting with the 365 service. You may have heard Gary mention the CLI from Microsoft 365. That is one example. We've also got PnP PowerShell. So that's a PowerShell library that also interacts with the service. So what people might do is then create scripts from those tools for doing specific things like creating SharePoint sites or teams with specific configurations and things like that that they have mapped within these scripts. So what we then do is then provide the script samples repositories designed for people to share those scripts, where they've created, it's almost like a recipe book really, where you've got all of the ingredients and then and the site shares the recipes for these sites or to do specific tasks and actions. So I own that particular initiative. Additionally, on top of that, I have in the past
sorry, Paul, just to confirm, what you're saying is that everyone does all the hard work and then you just take all the glory from it. Is that your role as a maintainer there, or?
Not quite. No, it's quite cheeky. The part of the initiative is to encourage others to share what they have done with others. So I do need to provide that space. And yes, there are other people probably contribute more scripts than I do. I have contributed some of them myself, but other people have contributed other scripts as well. And as a maintainer, you might find it does lean that way anyway, because you've got all these people that can feed into the actual the meat of the repository is the samples themselves. So the maintainer is more about coordinating, making sure that the site runs smoothly, any issues are solved, that kind of thing. So it's not necessarily the writing of the scripts themselves. So
I think that's an important point there, is that the maintainer doesn't necessarily, I just got to be very clear, I'm not saying that in your case, but doesn't have to be the most technically gifted person that's working on a project. It could be someone who's just got that coordination. And I absolutely don't think that's the case in the script samples, before I get in real trouble. But it's the person who sort of overall governs it and looks forward to it. And I think, having joked about you taking the glory, actually the thing I love about what you do with the PnP script samples is you make sure that people are recognized for that, which I think we'll talk a little bit more about later as well from there. Maybe if we move on to the next slide and talk about what some of those more specific things are.
Yeah.
So I think for an open source maintainer, you've got that. We talked previously about within GitHub, you've got people registering issues, and whether those are actual issues of problems of the way it works, or whether they're suggestions, new ideas on things that could be done and directions from it. And so making sure that those get not really assigned, but I guess in some cases assigned, that you've got all the information within there that goes through, and we'll talk about that in a sec. And then we got the pull requests. We talked in the previous one that people will be submitting fixes or changes for those issues or things they've identified. They'll be working in their repository and managing that together within that pull request as well. So making sure that those are reviewed and picked up from there. Those two is probably very visible to people as a committer and watching projects on there. What probably isn't quite so visible is the second one there, the second batch, so the number 3 and 4 on the screen. That setting of the strategy, so that overall goal, and think about that, is really important, because I'm sure it will evolve in ways that people don't think of initially, and things will change in the environment as well. There may be changes to the platform, there may be changes to what's happening there. So getting that overall view of what's taking place. And then there's always going to be arguments and debate, whether sort of healthy arguments, whether sometimes not so healthy, of people seeing things going in different ways. So being the arbiter of that. But I think if we jump into more specific on that, and I think, Paul, if you want to cover on the next slide, talking about kind of managing of issues.
Yeah, so we'll go through managing pull requests. So
this is the wrong order. Whoops. Go on then.
That's all right. It doesn't matter. It's all good. So with pull requests, so as a maintainer, you're going to get people that especially when you start generating interest for the repository, and we'll talk about generating interest a bit later, and people will start to contribute to your repository. They may set, so for example, for the script samples, I have a set of guidelines on a site. So script samples is divided up into 2 parts, and I'll show you a bit later. You've got the repository itself, and we use GitHub Pages to host a HTML-based site for visually seeing the samples. And on that site, I've provided a set of guidance for how I want samples to be submitted, the kind of formats. I'll go into a bit more detail with those in a little screenshot demo later. And so when people do submit pull requests, they know what to submit, because the difficulty thing about these repositories, especially if you're a contributor, is when you got this repository in front of you on GitHub, you're like, how do I interact with it? How do I submit a PR? What do you expect from me as a contributor? And as a maintainer, you need to define what that looks like for those contributors. So what you're getting in terms of expectations of the pull request, and B, you can then vet those and make sure that the contributors are adhering to that standard, or even potentially nudging them to follow that standard. And sometimes a lot of what I do is when I get pull requests, I grab that pull request. At the moment, it's fairly manual. I download it locally. I run the site generator that I use to make sure that the sample itself doesn't break the site in any way, and then validate whether all the metadata is in place, because it does link with other things, and I'll go through that in a bit later. So I perform all those checks. I don't perform checks on the scripts themselves, mainly because some of them are very specific use cases, and that would be it's not a scalable way of checking this. But in terms of code quality, what I tend to do is provide code quality is a bit of a difficult subject, really, because in some ways I don't want to box how people. Well, I don't want to box people into my way of thinking, if that's the way, or my standard. Everybody has their style. Everybody has their way of doing things. So, but at the same time, I encountered a discussion on Twitter about, if I specify no standard, do people get locked into this this problem of, is my script good enough? Do I is it ready for the wider audience? You know, because it will become more public. So you submit a script that you have maybe on your local machine or server or wherever you stored that, and you say, I'm going to put it on this site. It's going to become more prominent. You are going to be more noticed for that piece of work. And so what I have done with that is provided a set of recommendations, optional recommendations for the sample, like indenting it, making sure that it's readable. You know, you've got nicely named variables, that kind of thing. Very, very, very simple stuff. I don't have like a 10-page code quality guide that you might see on you know, the C# formats or PowerShell, you know, for those kind of things. So that's the kind of guide, and that helps contributors know, hey, I know I've got this. I know the format of the articles that I submit and things like that. So that helps them to generate that pull request as well.
And how did that evolve over time? Is that something you had previously, or have you kind of had feedback around certain scripts and gone, yeah, we should do that this time, or a bit of both?
So I kind of wrote that from the beginning, actually. So it's something that because previously to creating this repository, I was a member of a different project within PnP, and I'd learned a lot from, you know, PnP itself. I learned a lot from how others do it, and so I extracted elements of the best bits from each of them when I built Script Samples. So I knew that I had to build somewhere where I can host the samples. I knew that I needed to provide guidance. So I you know, worked with some of the other members and say, how did you write your guidance, and then sort of change that. So at the start of its launch, it was all there. Occasionally, I get the odd comments and think people do very kindly feedback, and that contributes, that documentation evolves. So when you feel like you're missing something, or people have been commenting and they've not done things in a certain way, you can refer to them to that location. But also it's almost like a front door as well. It's like, here, this is what I'm hoping to expect from you, and things like that. So, and that's how it's evolved. And to be fair, I've not had too many variances away from that standard and away from the format that I need to incorporate those samples into the site.
That's really nice. And I think we talked last time when I was with Gary about the submission I was doing on the CLI, and there are certain things you're going to get from a document, and certain things to get to very fine detail, especially when you get to the very large code heavy ones. So I know your script samples, you've got there's lots in there, but there's lots of blocks. For the CLI, it's a massive chunk of code that all needs to work together in a standard way. And the one that, for me, I kept making a mistake was spelling. And the reason was that I like an S instead of a Z. I follow the UK English instead of the US English. And the guidance was that it should be US English as the kind of broader one. So that was the kind of thing that came through in the comments on the pull request. So there were certain things that, yes, possibly I should have read the documents a little better. There were other that kind of the very nitty gritty details that really make some of the more stronger and easier to work with elements on there. And I know you can get things like linting and others that you can put some rules within the code that can dictate and can help guide people as they're doing things. But there's also going to be things that just can't easily get picked up by that. And I think that's that alignment to strategy. And we'll talk about strategy in a sec as well, is one of the important things, because it's not all pure code quality. It's not all does it work. There's that kind of wider aspect as things grow as well.
In terms of the samples themselves, you mentioned spelling. Actually, one of the things I don't do is spell check the samples, almost intentionally. But, well, unless they spell SharePoint with a capital,
that's what you say
capital
now.
P. But I don't spell check the samples, because if there is an error, then someone might feel they want to contribute to something, but they're not at the level of they're not comfortable with coding or things like that. So there is an opportunity, and I'm sure I'll receive a PR soon from this. There is an opportunity to actually go through some of the samples and correct some of the spelling areas in the way that people described it, because some people do write them quickly and they post and things like that. But it gives them a platform that if someone is new to the entire contributing experience, they're not they're not familiar with Markdown, they're not familiar with submitting a PR on GitHub, and they want to practice in some way. So that's why I've kind of deliberately left those that aspect out of the quality checks. It's almost like a little playground of going, hey, I want to contribute something. I don't know where I just that spelling error there is really bugging me. I'm going to try and submit a PR, and they can choose to go through David Warner's Sharing is Caring program to learn how to do PRs, and then potentially go over to this repository and correct that mistake if they want to. And I'm more than happy to accept that. I could run it through a checker. But there is an intention behind not doing that. But what I definitely don't do is modify any of the PowerShell scripts or those samples in there. Well, unless of course someone has posted things like credentials.
Oh, right. Yes. Yeah. That's
well, like I said, I don't check this. So there is a small expectation on the person submitting the sample that their sample works. And I suppose in some ways it would have done, if otherwise they wouldn't have written it, if that makes sense. So it's that kind of thing. So, and because the script sample site is so open to other types of scripts, I'd have to cater for every library, every method of connecting into the service, which
absolutely,
which is not
entirely
scalable. Yeah.
I think it's interesting that you don't test the scripts as well, which I completely agree with. I don't think you could sort of see a lot of that on there. It's just not realistic. Whereas you've got other ones. I know the PnP PowerShell, they have a kind of shared SharePoint instance, and other kind of more aligned to Azure deploying things. They actually will deploy and have a running version of that can be a playground. So it's not to say that you shouldn't always do that. There are many cases where you'll deploy to a shared environment, actually be able to have those running. CLI, I know, runs some unit tests which would purely look at that as kind of isolated code. You can run integration tests that will actually run those and confirm results come back as you expect. So and it may be something you have initially that doesn't do that. You may build that up over time, but we might talk about that a little bit later as we get onto the going it alone. Let's go on to the slightly candidly ordered and talk about issues now, because I think in terms of issues, some of the looking through those, making sure there's enough information. If you were listening to the last session, if you did miss the last session, it is available on YouTube on the Microsoft React one, so do go back and have a look at that. But one of the things we showed on there was that when you raise an issue in the CLI, it has some kind of pre-built template that guides you on what you should fill in when you're raising things in there. So is it a new item? Is it some new idea you're looking to put in there? Is it a break, and where does this occur? And part, I think, of the maintainers is to make sure that there is enough information that people can work out what the issue is. You don't want to have to kind of keep asking questions to the original poster within there, because they may have moved on with other things. They might have just had a nice free afternoon, found a bug, logged it quickly, and then they're moving on. They may not entirely be involved with things. So as a maintainer, trying to make sure and chase people as early as possible to get that information as well. Agreeing that the request that's being submitted, especially if it's a new idea, actually makes sense to things. And that again, we talked about that strategy, that when people are suggesting ideas that aligns with the strategy, the one I put in for the CLI was around bringing in search. It may have been that they didn't feel the focus of that was going that far. You could say the CLI, should that cover dynamics? Should it cover posting things to Azure? Is that too broad from things? So having a look at that request and seeing, does it fit with the overall aim of the things? And occasionally you will make an issue and you'll say, yep, I'll pick up that, and you'll start it, and you'll have all the goodwill in the world that you'll have it done by Christmas. And then kind of Christmas comes, and there's some nice turkey and some nice wine, and then New Year comes, and then your kids get COVID. And so it can be that these issues can drag on some time. I'm not speaking from any particular experience here, maybe, but it is that notion that you may want to sort of say, if people have said they're taking hold of fixing issue and it's taking a bit longer, maybe there's someone else who can jump in and fill that gap. So managing those things there. Is there anything else you throw in that about managing issues, Paul?
Yeah, so I don't do too much with the managing issues with the script sample, but as a maintainer, you have more access to managing these issues than you do as a contributor. So, for example, signing labels, assigning tasks to people, things like that, and also defining what those labels are. So there is some onus on, because you can use the issues list for quite a number of different things. And so for me, what I do with that list is I've defined a list of sample ideas. So if people want to contribute but don't really know what to do, it's having that sort of nugget of an idea they can go away and potentially write that script up and submit it as a PR. One of the other things that Script Sample does support is the notion of, you may end up doing a specific task with a particular service. So that I want to create a team in a team in Microsoft 365, but you can do that with PowerShell, you can do with the graph, you can do that with the CLI. So it does support scripts of those multiple types. So what tends to happen quite often is the suggestions are more like, well, we've got this PnP PowerShell one. Here's a sample idea for the CLI version of this or the graph version of this, so they can go away and it does what the contributors do like that, actually having those gaps. And I've got a hidden matrix page where I can see the gaps between the samples, and then they can well, it's not really hidden because it's public, you just need to know the URL. It's like public hidden thing. People can then have that sort of guidance on where to go, and you can also use that as a way to publicize this repo. You can say, hey, I've got this set of things that I need to for some people to take care of, or some ideas if you want to encourage people in. It's not that sort of like that carrot to give people something to contribute to. Yeah, and you can grade them like that as well. I know that the CLI does that. They do like first issue and things like that. So if you're new to a repository and they have organized like that, check out those labels, and that's a good way from a contributor. From a maintainer, you have to write that sort of guidance. If there is any sort of guidance to help people get started, you may need that initial conversation with the person that is getting assigned that, so you can help them on their journey. So there is all that aspect, and I also log things like bugs and enhancements as well to the issues list. So I've got like a little roadmap that I aim for, what I envisage I want to do with that, but also it keeps it very public as well. So if other people have ideas, they can comment on what I've put, and they can write their own, and then I can comment on that, and then these features could be developed by myself or another set of contributors. So it's a way of that bringing that engagement idea, and the methods of engagement with people.
So talking of roadmaps there, maybe if we move on to the next one of talking about strategy, and I think there's three major items in there, which is defining that roadmap. And I've got a question for you in a sec about how you do that and how you share that, which would be in there. I think there's a managing change in versions. So much as we'd love to put a repo and have the only thing that changes in there is what you decide to change, there are other factors. So whether it's the Microsoft software that you're working with, like SharePoint, Microsoft 365, the underlying Azure platform that you're using, could be things like Java versions, all sorts of other things in there. Certainly if you're using NPM, other things, all those are going to change, and there could be security issues. So there is always going to be churn within your repo within it that needs to be maintained. So kind of looking at that and making sure you've captured those needs that go in there. The final one is an interesting one, and possibly it can be slightly controversial to people, and that is at some point you're connecting to a system or you're supporting something there's going to be a drop off for support. So the examples, I think PnP PowerShell has been a great example where they used to support on-prem. They've put the freeze on that. They've moved to a modern version that just focuses online. They've seen the growth in that. They've looked at the numbers to go in there. Probably a broader version, not that we're too obsessed with Microsoft 365, so come away from that, is supporting IE. Obviously, IE is now, I've got to get this right, it's end of life. No, coming end of life this year. It's not supported by an awful lot of things. A lot of products like Microsoft 365, Salesforce, a lot of Google ones won't support IE. If you're maintaining one, you've got to decide at what point do you drop that support for it. Do you want to be very early with these things and be very future focused? Are you looking at that kind of longer tail? So agreeing that, and I know there's many cases where people will, I was about to say fork off. I don't mean that in any rude way, but they'll take your repository and say, well, fine, if you don't want to support that, I'll take it from that point and carry on maintaining it as a separate stream focused on that longer one. So there's lots of options there within that. But coming back to roadmap. So Paul, you mentioned that you keep a roadmap. Is that a public roadmap that you make available, or is that scribbled back of fag packets?
Well, it's not a pretty diagram like you see on the screen there, where I've got like in 2022 I'm going to achieve this, 23 to this, and because it's more organic than that. So it depends on the samples that come through, the usability. So if there's, like, for example, I do use Clarity, they've got like heat maps and things like that. So if there's something that's not sitting right with certain things, then I can make adjustments to the site. One of the biggest things that I have to keep doing is adding filters and things like that, because of the new types of scripts that could be introduced into the library. So I started off with 3. So that's PnP PowerShell, SPA Management Shell, and CLI, both Bash and PowerShell. I still count that as 3. My math, I got 3 things. And now it's expanded to cover things like Azure CLI types of scripts and Power Apps and various others that have come through. So there may be things that people want to submit a script. They think, I've had people go, can I put this here? Does it fit here? And I say, yes, it does. I'll make it fit by adjusting the site to meet that. So you might get that kind of roadmap item that is caused by someone wanting to contribute something that doesn't quite fit into your repo that you may need to make adjustments for. The other things that you might end up doing is you want to do, like, for example, so I've got quite large card views, so I may want a list view. I'm even tempted to play around to see if I can integrate it with the Azure shell. Which would be pretty cool. So you can have the script and the Azure shell. I need to test to see if this works, but at the moment it's in the roadmap to have those items within there. So I try to keep it very public, and I may get the odd requirement from the other PnP members because they're doing something. For example, I
think the important thing that is your sample you've got there that you'd love to do, you maybe don't have time to do it. Someone else could pick that up as well. So having that public idea roadmap really helps with that. And I think if we look at other larger roadmaps, that the kind of Node.js is open source, and they have the long-term support version, they have the kind of very preview version. So as soon as people are hatching ideas, there's a branch that you can look at and try out, so you can see the different elements from that. So I think it's quite important to sort of set that and then be as public with that as possible to get people to contribute to.
Absolute transparency is one of the rules that I follow with this this repository. So yeah,
absolutely. Now, some people might disagree, and they may think it's a waste of time. If you've got a script for PnP, that's all you need to do. You don't need to do it CLI. What happens then, Paul? With a subtle hint to move to the next slide as well. I try not to be too like Chris Whitty, basically.
So with the different versions, I drop in that example, if that's what you mean by that. So I drop in the say, hey.
No, I was thinking more of moving on to handling disputes, and someone saying, let's not move on to let's debate, because some people will have the view that you should only have a CLI version or only have a PowerShell version, or someone you talked about code quality. So on the next slide we'll talk about sort of how you handle those debates. I don't know if you've got any. I think you mentioned you've got an example you talk about.
Yeah, so I'll move on to the handling disputes sort of slide there. So the one thing that I am currently in conversations with is there's a sample that's been posted and someone had done a surprise PR, and people do, and this is one thing as a maintainer that you'll
apologies.
Get.
Could you explain surprise PR for people?
So it's when someone has written a large change to your repository and submits it as a PR, and then go, hey, are you okay if you accept this change of 50% of your code base? And it's like that kind of PR. They haven't engaged with you. They haven't set an issue or a discussion. Initially. It's like it was unexpected. That's what I mean by surprise PR. Especially little ones are fine. Especially if you're testing the water, as it were. But if you write something substantial, I mean, the CLI would probably reject such a change anyway. If you'd gone and rewrote half the code base and then you submit a PR, it wouldn't pass muster. But if you did it small piece by piece, describe what you want to do in an issue first before you create that PR. That's fine. So I've had I'm working through an issue at the moment where someone has submitted quite a substantial rewrite to a sample. I think I have a route for it. It is new learning for me as well. So you'll have different disputes that require different tactics for handling, and I always try and leave on a positive note. Thank you for your contribution, that kind of thing. We need to review this to decide the next step for accepting this PR. So always handle it in a positive way, even though the outcome may not be positive for them, or you may be able to steer them towards an alternative route that they're happy with and you're happy with, and that satisfies what you're doing as a maintainer. It's quite fluid in that aspect. You're going to have different people. They're going to have different responses and emotion. You need to handle that. Always try and handle with a positive and positive manner. That's my approach anyway for handling those disputes.
It's tricky. We talked with Gary before that this is all asynchronous. This is all in chat. Yeah. It's not like you can have that back and forth message where you can kind of get a bit of feeling of how people are feeling. It could be days between things, could be a few hours before you look those. So it is a harder thing to do, I think, within these repositories, and doing that than if you're meeting face to face. You are less likely to get punched, so there is that benefit from things, or kicked by a horse. But it can explode more easily, because when you say something, when you type something, you may not get across the kind of full nuance of what you're trying to say. So I would say, if you are having a debate, just certainly take a moment to think about things and try and get the perspective, because it can flare up very easily when it's purely text-based. And we'll talk about the amount of time you have to do this and when you do this later, but it's worth thinking about that.
But ultimately, you are the owner of that repository, and it is your decision to make about what the final outcome is. I always try to end up with a positive outcome. I'm one of those people who like to have their cake and eat it kind of people, so that everybody's happy with the repository. So in the case of this sample, I probably will end up either splitting the sample into two, so like an alternative approach to the same thing, or having a separate tab within the same. I've got a few ideas regarding that, and I'm in discussions with the original author about that as well.
Giving people options, that's a nice idea. So this kind of leads us on nicely to the next bit about how you can work with maintainers. We're talking about how you handle disputes and things like that, but also how you engage with sort of submitting those ideas in the first place. So I think if we jump onto the next slide, one of the things that we're looking to cover now is how can you be a better committer? Now you know what a maintainer does. We talked about that, different things on there. How can you be a better committer? And I think some of the key things that we've covered this a little bit already, but providing good information in the issues, making sure you're clear if it is a bug, you've sort of said when it occurs, give a way that's repeatable on there, making sure you read the guidelines. Yes, I am awful at that. I hate reading long documents, but I do try and do it and pick up on there. And so if people pick up on things that are in the guidelines, you've missed it, just hold your hands up and be nice on there, and try and look at those as much as possible on there. Then the kind of longer term things is advise on strategies. So kind of say where this is going, and hopefully like Paul, the repo you're looking at has a bit of a roadmap, has an idea on where things are going. Maybe it's using GitHub pages to put some thoughts on that, and maybe say what your thoughts on that, in a nice way. I would say that there's a lot of repos now that have started to get the discussions tab, so it's not necessarily an issue. You can raise that discussion and say, have you thought about this? Have you done these things? And even provide your inputs into where the maintainers are actually asking things as well. I think the last two are really important to make life easier for people. When you're making those pull requests, almost exactly to what Paul was talking about, that surprise PR there, make sure that when submitting something, it's focused, and communicate about it. Say up front what you're planning to do, say how you're going from there. If you're going to take a bit longer, let let whoever it is know that they're going to be involved in it, and it might take you a bit longer and when you're going to pick it up. But communicate on that, and when you submit it, be very clear it's just this one issue. So when we talked about the CLI, I know Gary covered a bit of this, it is only one command at a time within your PR. Even though I put two very similar commands in there, they had to be separated and go in from one point at a time, because it means they can be evaluated. If there's any issues, it makes it a lot easier to integrate that, not fully rebasing the whole thing. If you do rebase, speak with them, because it may be a separate branch, and talking about that strategy, it could be a full new version of it, which then can have a lot bigger communication, a lot bigger change to things on it. And all of this is a lot of effort. The vast majority of people doing this within GitHub are doing it for fun on there. They are not getting anything out of it. This isn't a day job. They don't get a salary from it directly. Obviously, they get recognition in the community and great things like that. It's not a bad thing. You get to meet lots more people, build your networks. You get to try things out, as we talked about in the first session. But this isn't a job. Within there, people are giving their own time to kind of help maintain this and provide these scripts in there. So just bear in mind when people might be doing this. I think, Paul, you had some lovely stats or thoughts around that from GitHub. I don't know if you managed to find it yet.
No, I didn't, but there is, but I do remember, I think it was one of the Microsoft conferences years ago. So they basically said I think they downloaded all the commits for, it was a test for the Azure data source. They downloaded all the commits for GitHub. And one of the things they did is run analysis on it. And one thing they picked out is that most of the commits happen in the evenings or weekends, which suggests that a lot of people do write code in their personal time. So bear in mind that people are probably writing this in their personal time. They've taken the time out of their day job to contribute to the community, and you need to understand and respect that when you're working with these people. That also, if you think like that, you also might not get speedy responses to any issues or comments. Some people do. Some people might take a few days because they've gone away and have a holiday with their little family, or and then come back to it. And then so you may need to think asynchronously with the way you interact with people as well, so that you can respect their patterns of contribution, if that makes sense.
And without making this all about me, some may be contributing some of the stuff when they've had a couple of glasses of wine in the evening as well. So some of those spelling mistakes may be influenced by that as well. There is nothing like a bit of drunk coding in the evening to kind of help the evening sail by as well. So think about those things when you're submitting those, and what it goes back to go through as well.
And if you're completely unsure, engage with the maintainer, and then go from there. And that's a good takeaway. Yeah.
Absolutely. And once you've started committing a bit more and going through, then the next natural step is to become a maintainer. And certainly if it's a project we spent a lot of time on, there's a natural path. I know that's the path Gary went through. He was committing, he was answering issues, he was testing things out on there, he was writing his own scripts on there. So he started then supporting to the team within that. So picking up those issues that he could see where he could help, answering questions within there. Wasn't mandated to do that, was just seeing things. And this is the thing with open source, people will just answer questions. That's part of the beauty of having this kind of community around that they'll go through. At that point, then you start to engage, you start to connect with those maintainers, you have those conversations in GitHub. It may go offline, whether it's through Twitter, whether it's through LinkedIn, other chat mechanisms are available as well, and have those conversations within there. So engage with the maintainers, and that will also tell you where they're struggling for help. So there will be that kind of very public, as Paul, you talked about, having that roadmap, making that available. But there may be things they just haven't even got round to kind of writing down in a nice way, that you said, yeah, I've kind of had this idea, and you could take that and build up there. You can start to make that offers of help and go in there. It's worth noting, the person looking after that may go, no, I'm good. This is my repository. I don't really need any direct help. I thank you for the issues, but don't really want to make it a more formal thing. I'll pick it in my own time and stuff on there. But make that offer and just be prepared to go on there.
And as a person, if people start to use your repository, if it becomes popular, like some of the PnP ones, hundreds of millions of people, hundreds of millions of commands have been run through those sort of tools and things like that. Is, as a person, you need to learn to scale as well. So this is an exercise that I need to do potentially quite soon with what I do. Is I need to be as a maintainer to introduce a new maintainer. So to support that person, it's a new experience for me, because don't forget the maintainers are probably could be doing this for the first time, so you need to understand that they may make mistakes.
It's my baby. Don't let
I will
it
put
go.
my hands up if I make a mistake on my repo, but yeah, but it's that communication. You'll find that you've got regular contributors, and those are potential candidates for bringing them into a team, and then that team will grow. And as the repository grows, or the project that you're working on grows, then you're able to scale. You can work out, you get to know them, and then you can sort of say, hey, do you want to come in? We can elevate your permissions in GitHub, and then you can do things like respond to issues, close issues, actually review the PRs yourselves, and expand in that way. And you can with GitHub permissions make it granular. So if you wanted to control that, you can incrementally increase their access as you gain confidence in them, and they gain confidence in what you're doing as well.
And I think it's worth saying we're talking here about becoming a maintainer on an existing repo. This is joining such as a PLI. Maybe you've heard about PnP Script Sample and you want to get involved. Send him a message. On there, your inbox can be flooding now, Paul. Sorry. But the other option is that maybe you have made that offer and Paul goes, no, it's my baby, I'm going to keep it. You could go alone on your own. So the next slide we're going to talk about is either starting your own repo. It could also be that you decide to fork an existing repo. So you could see that there's something there that doesn't go down the direction. The example you gave with PnP PowerShell, where they made that decision to not support on-premises SharePoints, and various other ones to do this. I think there was Node. There was a massive fork of Node at some points that's kind of spun off into its own world. So I would say if you're going to do that, make sure you do communicate with the original one. Make sure you're not going to kind of suddenly open up a world of arguments between lots of people, because generally they'll be very happy to hear about that. But whatever you're doing, you can start to move on your own repo. Paul, how do you kind of, as someone who does effectively just work on their own, what does that mean to you? How does that differ to anything we talked about already?
So as we say, talk about maintaining. So if you wanted to build your own repo and then go through the process of developing it and then sort of building it up, so you'll have a vision that you want. You have an idea, you want to put it out there. You build a repo. You may end up building a site that talks about that. So one thing that for example, with the script samples, so we had the idea of hosting some of the scripts. So immediately you'll know that you'll need some basic components to support the project that you're thinking about. So for example, I needed somewhere to host it in order to act as the front door, because I wasn't entirely happy with, say, the README of GitHub, the first README page. I wanted something a bit stronger that I could control on a HTML level. So you could have that sort of you'll have that idea of what you want to build. So you'll have these components, and you may end up building a lot of this yourself, or you can, if you've got someone to work with, or you need letterheads, you can bring those in and do that. So once you've built that repository, don't spend huge amounts of time polishing it to death and making it absolutely perfect. Get something out the door that people can then engage with, and then it can grow with continuous contributions from people. So once you've built this repository, then the next bit you need to do is then advertise it's there. So GitHub is massive. There's hundreds of millions of developers. So it's like, how do you tell people about your repository? So now I had the benefit of hooking into an existing community, so you've got the Microsoft patterns and practices. So I was able to leverage things like the community calls or any sort of Twitter accounts, official that, and they help with the advertisement. But it is a continuous thing. I continuously advertise the repository, because Twitter, I think, has something like a lifetime of 8 minutes before it's gone from the feed. Blogs are 2 years. There's certain communication channels where that particular message has a lifetime before it gets forgotten about, or and so forth. So you might have this continuous advertisement for your repo. People need to know it exists, and then they can start to engage with it. They can either consume it or become contributors, and then eventually maintainers. So there's that aspect to this. And once you've got those contributors hooked in and you've got that continuous cycle, what I also do with my contributors, I'm again talking about the fact that people um, do contribute in their own time. The most important thing I do is make sure that people are recognized for that particular piece of work. It's super important, because people have contributed their personal time to your repository, so you want to make sure that you can thank, it's difficult to thank for them digitally. There's no money involved. There is that sort of buy me a coffee feature. I think there's on or sponsors on
so that script you asked me to do, you're not going to pay me for that? Oh, goodness.
Exactly. But we have initiatives within PnP to make sure that you're listed as a contributor on the community call, so you've got your name, a thank you in a public place. I use Twitter, to advertise your sample to people, A, so that they know it's there and they can consume it, but B, it's also the way of saying, hey, this person has made this sample, it looks awesome, go check it out, kind of thing. And the third thing is it's a fairly new initiative, is we now issue badges through Credly, which is the same system as if go from Microsoft Exam. PnP, Microsoft PnP is the first one that Credly has done where they've accepted community-based badges. So we use that mechanism that they can collect these badges as a way of saying, hey, thank you so much for what you've done. I super appreciate everything that you've done, and that's the appreciation that I give through that.
That's great. And as a company that know how much people love badges, so maybe get some physical ones soon. That'd be even better.
I would love that. I'd love to have some physical versions of my my badge to stick on my laptop. Would be awesome.
That would be really good. Okay, I think we'll go on to the wrap up and summary, and I can see there's a couple of questions there. Paul, there's one if you want to have a think about, because I don't know the answer to that one, but we'll come to. But in summary, thinking about what maintainers do, they manage the repo, they make sure that that the issues are being maintained, that work coming in continues to align with that ongoing strategy. They support people who are contributing about doing it the right way, about bringing things on, aligning to what needs to be done, making sure they understand all the things that need to be done to contribute in the right way, giving that recognition to people, as Paul will say, which I think is so important, to encourage people to do more, support them, make it easy to do, recognize when they do a nice job with it on there. And then realize that this is a community, that this is a broad group of people. So whether you've got a team working on it, just you, there is a community around it that you can start to build up. And that is where the power of open source comes from. I know Gary, Paul, and I talk about community an awful lot. It's because that is the magic of this, is being able to support people with a tool that can help them make their job more effective, make things easier, do more interesting things, and can pull new ideas, give people opportunities to look at new technology, to look at new ways of working, to look at new things within that. And all, yes, it's going to sound fluffy to some people, but it is lovely. If I know, and I'm welling up here genuinely, which is quite sad, going to Comsverse, the first in-person conference I went to after the pandemic, and seeing some people I'd never met in real life and having them run up and hug me, and even though I'd never met them before, it builds in that passion that people have, because you've got similarly minded people working together to deliver great stuff. And that's where, being a maintainer, you can see that. Paul, I know some of the scripts that have come through are just things you wouldn't have thought of at all, and they're fantastic. And that is the magic of a lot of this stuff. So yeah, do go out there, commit, think about how you could be a maintainer, get involved, things like that. If you do have any questions coming through, and please do add them to the chat. Rav, I can see a couple in there. If there are any more, please do throw them into there. But the first one, and I'm going to defer this over to you, Paul, and you may be panicking at this point, but someone said, I'd love to hear about the favorite GitHub apps and integrations that reduce a maintainer's jobs.
So I don't use too many, but the one that I use, I guess it's not an app as such, but I use GitHub Actions a ton. So so the one thing that my script samples site does is it takes the markdown pages that I use to host the content and converts it into a site. I use docfx as the engine. So what I have done is I've integrated all of that through GitHub Actions, so I don't have to generate that site locally and upload the HTML. So I utilize that. No, I'm not hosting. It's all done with GitHub Pages, so that's the host. GitHub Actions is the thing that processes the markdown. I'm always constantly tweaking the engine to do different things. With GitHub Actions, I discovered recently actually about PowerShell integration. You can run PowerShell scripts before and after it, so it allows me to do some pre and post processing as well. So for example, I've got some scripts that go through all the samples and say, hey, which one's a PnP PowerShell, which one's a shell, and put that. I mentioned that matrix page that's actually generated in PowerShell beforehand. But again, GitHub Actions is totally the thing I use. I don't tend to use other apps. The only thing I do use quite often is when I'm maintaining issues and I'm on the run. I do use the iOS app for GitHub on my mobile device. It's really good for maintaining the issues and things like that, and at least checking out the PR. I don't tend to do the PR processing on my mobile device because I like to pull it down and have a look and see if it generates and things like that. But generally, GitHub Actions is the tool, and then I've got that app as a way of just doing that kind of light touch, hey, I'm looking at this soon, to keep people doing. Because one thing I do try to do is if people have submitted a PR, I try to respond fairly quickly to say, hey, I'm either going to be processing this or I'll process this later, just so that you know that as a contributor that someone has acknowledged that you have submitted that, because there is that aspect. Is you could submit a PR and it sits there for 2 years, and that's horrible. And nobody likes the fact that you've done that effort. So as a maintainer, I make sure I respond fairly quickly to say, hey, I'm going to be looking at this. Or if there's a significant delay,
where the iOS app is particularly useful.
I can respond fairly quickly. There are little tricks actually with the responses as well. So there's a little templating feature, so you can have like templated replies that I then tweak to make it a bit more personalized, to save you writing the same text over and over again. So it's a bit of a cheat, but and I tend to waffle on in some of my comments, but it's little things like that cut down the processing time. I've got tons of integrations that I need to consider. I need to automate my one thing I do is tweet about the samples that get posted fairly. As soon as I've done the merge, I tend to post it on Twitter and then have another schedule to repost it during working hours, so people again have that second visibility. That isn't automated as such, so I do stuff like that.
So you could use something like Power Automate or Logic apps to kind of have those triggers and auto tweet when things happen as well.
Indeed, yeah. Once I've got the engine perfect, at the moment I'm using Microsoft Lists to capture all the PRs that come through and maintain, so I can keep a track of what I've submitted on social media under some certain, because I've got a template that I use. So I sort of built a little mini social engine in Microsoft Lists for doing things in a specific way. So which is
sounds like a blog post
cool.
waiting to happen.
Yeah. What I need to do is get the bit where it automates and actually post to Twitter. Once I've done that, I think that'll be ready.
Then go
absolutely,
through.
Yeah.
So I have on the side very kindly Gary, who is in a meeting, and I've just disrupted him, but he's replied to my chat, and they with the CLI that because there's more of them. One of the issues they found with using pure GitHub was that kind of private communication, and I think they tried a WhatsApp group for a while, but they ended up using Basecamp to kind of have that longer term, be able to track kind of tasks and different actions going on that maybe didn't need to be quite so public, and make it easier to fill out. I'm possibly speaking for Gary, so he may be listening going, oh, don't say that, Kev. But that's my understanding of how they've used that within there as well. The other one he did mention is also, if you are using Teams a lot, there's a GitHub Teams app. So send them to that iOS app and getting those notifications. You can get the same in Teams and get those alerts coming through as a bot within Teams that gives you that flow of work of where you're often doing things. Again, a little bit trickier when it is on your own time. You might not want to put that into your kind of corporate area, but if it's something where you're working is very happy to do that, making use of that can be very useful as well.
Indeed. I know that Gary's done lots of good work via the base account with contribute. That's the next level, really, is how you coordinate with. I think CLI's got something like 80 contributors, 80 active contributors, something like that. It's really good stuff in that space. Is how you coordinate between all those people doing all those things, and that's CLI is a really good example of that.
Definitely. There's another question there of how do you decide when to stop supporting things? So we talked about that idea of IE, and we talked about PnP PowerShell supporting on-premise, and I don't think there's a definite answer on there. It kind of depends. I think if something goes out of support from Microsoft, you've got a pretty good reason to from that point. I think if you've got metrics, I know with the PnP they're very good at having those analytics of knowing who's using it, when, where, how, and looking at the numbers and seeing that drop off. Paul,
jump in quickly.
Else?
Yeah, I can jump in quickly with that. So PnP PowerShell are testing something very soon. So they're switching. They're removing a component using for CSOM from the PowerShell. So what they've done is they've tested the waters with the community to advise that this is coming up. They're working on the background, so testing the water to see if there's the screams in the background and things like that. So, but as a maintainer, it's your prerogative and your decision about what you want to do. But again, you need to respect on who may be consuming your repository. So
it comes back to that communicate again, doesn't it? But thank you very much, Paul. If you do have any other questions, I'll hand back to Rav shortly. But if you do have any other questions, at Kev McDonk, I think if you go to the next slide, Paul, at Kev McDonk on Twitter or at PK Bullock, do give us a shout if you've got any other ones on there. At Gary Trinder as well, if you've got a question on the CLI, which we've touched on a bit there. Otherwise, thank you much. We've really enjoyed doing this series on there, and we hope it's helped. So we'd love some feedback. Let us know what you think. Otherwise, Rav, back over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining in. Obviously, this was the last episode of the series, but all of the episodes can be found on the Reactor YouTube channel. And I have actually posted the links to previous two videos on the chats. And hopefully, Kevin will probably, and Paul, will see you sometime later in the year doing another series for us.
Didn't want to commit too much publicly, but there we go. There it is. I guess on that note, if there are things you'd like to know about open source that maybe we haven't covered, please do tweet us and let us know what you'd like to hear as well.
Indeed.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Paul. Have a great evening. And we shall see you sometime later in the year. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much, Rav.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.